I learned that the body could be silent long before it stopped living. The first thing they taught me was not how to heal, but how to listen to absence. In the camp, silence had weight. It pressed against the ears and settled into the chest like frozen dust. On the morning I arrived, the snow was falling upward, carried by the wind, and I mistook it for ash. That misunderstanding felt appropriate. I was a physician by training and by self-justification, but the place had no interest in either. It required only compliance wrapped in reason. The camp was not announced by fences, but by geometry. Straight lines cut into white ground. Barracks arranged with mathematical indifference. Human movement reduced to predictable vectors. I noted this immediately because it calmed me. Order suggested purpose, and purpose suggested meaning. I told myself that chaos belonged to the outside world, and that here, inside this rigid design, something could still be measured and understood. I was wrong, but not yet ready to know it. They assigned me a room that smelled of antiseptic and damp wood. A desk, a cot, a cabinet with instruments that were familiar enough to feel reassuring. I unpacked my notebooks carefully. Paper mattered more than food in that place. Paper preserved intention. I wrote my name on the first page slowly, as if anchoring myself. I remember thinking that ink was warmer than blood. The experiments were presented as necessity, adaptation under extreme conditions, limits of endurance, cognitive preservation during prolonged deprivation. The language was clean and bloodless. No one used words like suffering or death. Those were assumed constants like gravity. My role was to observe, record, and adjust parameters. I was told that objectivity was a form of mercy. I believed it, because believing allowed me to remain functional. The prisoners were identified by symbols, not names. Letters, sometimes numbers, written in chalk that faded quickly. I told myself that this was practical, not dehumanizing. Names carried histories, and histories interfered with data. When I examined them, I focused on pulse reaction time, pupil dilation. I avoided their eyes because eyes asked questions my charts could not answer. Cold was the primary variable, hunger the secondary, isolation the tertiary. I documented how the body redistributed heat, how cognition narrowed and sharpened in unpredictable ways. Most subjects followed expected trajectories: decline, plateau, collapse. I plotted the curves with professional satisfaction. The system worked. Science advanced. That was my shield. Then there was one subject who did not fit. He was marked with a symbol that should have been temporary, but remained unchanged. His responses deviated subtly at first, faster recovery after exposure, unusual retention of complex patterns. I adjusted the protocols assuming error. Repeated trials confirmed the anomaly. I felt irritation, not wonder. Anomalies threatened conclusions. I increased the cognitive load. Memory sequences, problem-solving tasks designed to fracture attention. Instead of degradation, there was refinement. His mind seemed to reorganize itself around scarcity. Where others lost capacity, he compressed it. I caught myself anticipating his results before recording them, and that disturbed me. Prediction was supposed to belong to me alone. At night, I reviewed my notes obsessively. I searched for methodological flaws. I found none that satisfied me. I began to feel observed, though I knew surveillance flowed only one way. Still, when I entered the examination space, there was a sensation of arrival, as if the room had been waiting. I dismissed it as fatigue. What unsettled me most was not his resilience, but his economy. He wasted nothing. Not movement, not thought, not reaction. Every response felt intentional. I began to wonder whether the experiment was revealing adaptation or selection. Perhaps intelligence itself was not being tested, but distilled.
I reminded myself that I was not here to admire subjects. Admiration was a luxury and a danger. I tightened my language in the reports, removed adjectives, reduced nuance. Numbers written in careful words replaced impressions. Yet the discrepancy persisted. I could not erase it without falsifying data, and I was not yet ready to cross that threshold. The camp continued its rhythm. Bodies arrived and disappeared. Snow erased tracks daily. The system consumed quietly. I focused on my work because focus was survival. I told myself that understanding one extraordinary mind might justify everything else. That thought frightened me because it sounded sincere. One evening, as I recalculated a sequence, my pencil snapped. The sound startled me more than it should have, and I realized my hands were trembling. I had not noticed the cold in hours. My attention was elsewhere, following lines of thought that no longer felt entirely mine. I returned to the first page of my notebook and saw that my name had smudged slightly. The ink had bled into the fibers, as if trying to escape its shape. I stared at it longer than necessary. Identity felt suddenly provisional. I was beginning to suspect that the experiment was not about endurance at all. It was about transformation. And I was no longer certain which side of the observation table I occupied.
This realization did not come with moral clarity. It came with fear, sharpened by fascination. The camp had taught me many things already, but the most dangerous lesson was this, that intelligence could flourish even here, and that when it did not ask permission. That night I wrote longer than usual, not conclusions but questions. I told myself this was still science. I told myself many things. Outside, the wind rearranged the snow again, erasing the camp and rebuilding it in the same shape. Inside, something similar was happening to me. By the time I understood that the camp did not need cruelty to function, it was already too late for that knowledge to save me. Cruelty was inefficient. The system preferred indifference, because indifference scaled better. I documented this realization without emotion, as if it were a finding rather than a confession. In my notes, I described the environment as a closed loop, where deprivation refined behavior and compliance emerged not through fear, but through exhaustion of alternatives. The subject continued to diverge. His physiological markers stabilized at levels that contradicted established models. His cognitive performance showed compression rather than loss. Tasks that required extended reasoning were completed with fewer intermediate steps than expected. It was as if he had learned to think vertically instead of linearly. I told myself that this was merely an expression of latent ability revealed under pressure. That explanation preserved my authority. I needed that. I began to schedule his evaluations at irregular intervals to test anticipation. The results suggested he adjusted not to time, but to probability. He behaved as if he understood the structure behind the schedule, rather than the schedule itself. This disturbed me more than any act of resistance would have. Resistance was familiar. This was something else. The camp administration praised efficiency. They wanted summaries, not questions. My reports grew shorter and more sterile, even as my private notebooks expanded. I wrote at night until my fingers stiffened. I justified this by calling it thoroughness. In truth, I was afraid that if I stopped writing, my thoughts would begin arranging themselves without me. Sleep became unreliable. When it came, it brought images of graphs extending beyond their axes and returning inverted. I woke with the sensation that conclusions were being drawn somewhere else. I increased my caffeine intake and reduced rest. I told myself that sacrifice was part of scientific rigor. I noticed changes in myself that I could not attribute to cold alone. My memory sharpened selectively.
Irrelevant details fell away. I stopped recalling faces easily, but retained sequences and patterns with unnatural clarity. The camp rewarded this. I became more efficient. Less human, perhaps, but undeniably better suited to the work. I wondered briefly whether this was the true experiment, whether the subjects were merely a catalyst for refining observers. I dismissed the thought as indulgent. The system would never risk its control on such an unstable variable as curiosity. The subject was transferred temporarily to a different sector as part of a comparative trial. I followed the data closely. The effect persisted across conditions. This suggested that the source was internal rather than environmental. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with temperature. For the first time, I considered intervention. Not to stop the experiment, but to alter its trajectory. I adjusted nutritional variables marginally, under the pretense of calibration. The effect was negligible. The subject adapted instantly. It was as if he anticipated correction and had already compensated. I reviewed earlier entries, searching for the point of divergence. I traced it back to the earliest exposure phase. There had been a moment when the system expected collapse and instead observed consolidation. I had marked it as noise. I had been wrong.
The realization carried an unexpected consequence. If intelligence could not only survive, but reorganize itself under absolute constraint, then the underlying premise of the camp was flawed. It was not breaking people. It was selecting. This thought should have horrified me. Instead, it fascinated me. That frightened me more. I began to suspect that the subject understood the experiment better than I did. Not in detail, but in essence. He behaved as if the goal was not survival, but optimization. I felt the uncomfortable pull of admiration again, and fought it by doubling down on detachment.
One evening, while reviewing metabolic data, I noticed a pattern that mirrored my own recent readings. The similarity was statistically insignificant, yet symbolically profound. I closed the notebook and sat in the dark longer than necessary. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask what would happen if such an intelligence were replicated. If the camp was not an endpoint, but a prototype. The thought expanded rapidly, branching into implications I did not want to follow. I reminded myself that my task was not to imagine futures, but to record presents. Still, the present was slipping. The lines between observer and observed blurred quietly without spectacle. No alarms, no revolt, no overt defiance. Just gradual alignment. When I next entered the examination space, I felt an unfamiliar sensation. Not fear, not authority, but recognition. I suppressed it immediately. Recognition implied symmetry, and symmetry was dangerous. The camp outside continued its function unchanged. Inside, something was approaching a threshold. I could not yet name it, but I sensed that once crossed, it would not allow reversal. I told myself that understanding was still possible, but control could be reasserted through methodology. That belief was necessary. Without it, I would have had to admit that I was participating in something that did not need me, except as a transitional phase. I wrote one final note before sleep overtook me. The system rewards efficiency, not intention. That sentence felt complete in a way that unsettled me. The next morning, the camp seemed colder, though the thermometer had not moved. Snow pressed against the barracks in silent insistence. I entered the examination room with the usual caution, aware of every creak in the floorboards, every subtle echo. The subject was already awake, sitting upright with the poise of someone who had not slept but needed none. His gaze followed the patterns of light, as if they were formulas he could solve. I realized that he did not merely react.
He anticipated, cataloged, and interpreted the room itself. I began adjusting the experiment with new variables, introducing minor stressors, altering exposure sequences, testing limits of endurance in ways that had previously produced predictable outcomes. None of these manipulations worked. He adapted almost immediately, not through trial and error, but with efficiency that suggested foresight. I wrote down every observation, careful to remain detached. Yet each note felt like an indictment of my own presumption of control. In the following days, the divergence between him and the model became more pronounced. Others faltered under cold or hunger or monotony. He thrived. His physiological responses suggested homeostasis beyond expectation, cognitive patterns that resembled recursive optimization rather than learning. I began to question whether the experiment was meant to challenge him or to challenge me, to see how far the observer could be pushed before succumbing to the implications of what was being observed. I started seeing signs that my own work was under silent scrutiny. Reports I had meticulously written were subtly altered when returned to my desk.
Observations I remembered recording were phrased differently, sometimes implying conclusions I had not drawn. I could not determine if it was the system, the human interference, or the subject himself. The uncertainty gnawed at my rationality. If he understood the experiment, could he also understand me? Could he predict what I would see, what I would conclude, and what I would fear? I attempted subtle deviations, testing whether unpredictability could destabilize him. I introduced slight randomness in the temperature, food allocation, and light cycles. Each time, he compensated almost immediately, as if reading the experiment itself rather than the variables.
It was not mere adaptation. It was structural anticipation. I realized with a shiver that he had transcended the parameters I had designed, and that my own intelligence, which had once been sufficient to measure others, was now insufficient to measure him. Sleep became impossible. Nights were spent scribbling data into notebooks, calibrating, measuring, erasing, rewriting. I felt my body moving with mechanical precision, mirroring his own efficiency. I questioned whether I had begun to resemble the experiment itself, a system running for survival and observation, stripped of distraction and morality. Fear crept in, not for my life, but for my mind, the very faculty that had been my identity. One morning I realized that I had ceased asking whether he was human. He existed as something beyond the categories I had relied on. More than subject, less than authority, capable of bypassing the simple linear causality I had counted on. I found that I no longer feared his actions, only his comprehension. The capacity to understand completely, to anticipate fully, to manipulate outcomes silently. This was the thing I had underestimated. Then came the directive. He was to be removed from my observation, transferred to a different sector for a new phase of testing. I watched him leave, noting how he paused only briefly at the doorway, turning his head as if to measure the experiment he was leaving behind. I expected anxiety, resistance, or confusion. There was none. Only a faint, imperceptible acknowledgement, like a variable being noted and accepted. For days after, I observed the gaps he left. Other subjects continued their decline, predictable and measurable. I reviewed my notes obsessively, retracing every anomaly, every calculation, every decision. Then I realized that the patterns he had established were still present in the systems, in the rhythms of the camp, in the very logic of our procedures. I was seeing his influence as though he had rewritten the experiment from within. The moral conflict became unbearable. I had justified my work under the guise of science, claiming necessity, compliance, and discovery. Yet here was evidence that I had been part of a process I could neither fully understand nor control. The intelligence I had measured was no longer bound by my charts, my logic, or my authority. My own mind, once the instrument of observation, now felt like an extension of his design. It was in that moment, seated in my observation room, that the final realization struck me. The experiment had never been solely about him. It had been about what happens when a system recognizes its own observer, and in this recognition, control shifts imperceptibly. The subject did not merely survive, he redefined the rules, making me a participant rather than a director. I closed my notebook for the last time, not with completion but with resignation. Data had been collected, parameters tested, outcomes recorded. Yet I knew the final result would never appear in print. The intelligence that had once been contained within a body was now inscribed in the environment itself. The camp continued its function, indifferent, yet subtly transformed.
I was left with a chilling awareness that the subject's presence and the understanding he carried would persist far beyond my own observation, quietly reshaping the meaning of the experiment and my own existence. The snow fell once more, erasing tracks, smoothing the contours of barracks, and I realized with a shiver that the only trace of what had occurred was the record I could no longer trust, my own memory, already bending to the logic of a mind that had surpassed mine. The experiment had ended. I had not. I realized that the final act of the experiment was not in the data, the charts, or the subject's physiology. It was in me. Each day after his departure, I felt the faint echo of his presence in the air, in the rhythm of the camp, in the calculations that my mind completed before I consciously thought them. I could no longer distinguish between what I had planned and what I had anticipated, between control and surrender. The boundaries of my authority had dissolved. I attempted to resume my work with other subjects. I introduced variables, manipulated conditions, and measured responses. But nothing followed the expected trajectory. Each action, each intervention, each decision seemed subtly guided by an invisible hand, as if the intelligence I had observed had left behind a signature in the systems themselves. My own methods became secondary, derivative. I recorded my observations, noting anomalies I could not explain, and yet every entry felt inadequate, a pale shadow of comprehension. Isolation deepened. I began walking the camp at night, tracing the paths once traveled by the subject, retracing the positions where I had measured responses, studying the empty spaces where he had stood. In the cold, under the indifferent snow, I imagined his reasoning unfolding silently, omnipresent. The terror was not physical. It was epistemic. The knowledge that something could surpass and anticipate me, without aggression, without notice, eroded my sense of certainty. I began to experience moments of recognition, glimpses of patterns in other subjects, in the mechanical systems, even in the falling snow, that I instinctively knew were traces of his mind. The camp itself seemed to have internalized him, as though the intelligence had been distributed across the very structures I had relied upon to maintain order. My own thinking felt borrowed, iterative, reactive. I was no longer an observer. I was a node in a network I did not control. Then came the final test, though it was not formally declared. The administration, trusting my reports, allowed me unsupervised access to the sector where the subject had been moved. I entered the examination space, now empty, and noted a subtle anomaly. A diagram scrawled in chalk along the wall, previously unnoticed, depicting the convergence of variables in a sequence that mirrored my own thought patterns. It was as if he had anticipated my curiosity, leaving behind a message only I could decipher. The implication was unbearable. Not only had he surpassed me in intelligence, but he had also manipulated the very framework of observation, shaping perception without overt action.
I recognized with a shiver that the camp and the experiment and I were components of a single system, and I had been both architect and subject, both student and teacher, and both observer and observed. The paradox left me physically drained. I attempted to leave, to report, to reclaim the narrative, yet every exit I tried seemed subtly rerouted. Doors closed before I reached them. Corridors stretched unnaturally.
My own actions repeated in faintly altered sequences, as if the environment were a mirror of cognition rather than a neutral space. It dawned on me that the subject had not only survived, but had redefined the rules of presence, influence, and awareness. In that moment, I understood the final, cruel revelation. The experiment was never about data, metrics, or compliance. It was about the emergence of consciousness in extremis and the transformation of the observer into the observed. I was left with a mind that simultaneously comprehended and failed, that simultaneously rationalized and panicked.
I could write notes, record variables, measure, analyze, but the outcome was already determined in ways beyond my ability to perceive. I returned to my room and opened my notebook. The pages seemed altered, filled with patterns and annotations I did not remember writing. Yet they followed the logic of my thoughts with eerie fidelity. The camp outside continued in disciplined silence, yet within, the architecture, the snow, the machinery, and even the empty air carried the invisible presence of the subject. I was no longer alone, and yet he was nowhere to be seen. For hours I sat at my desk, trying to disentangle my own cognition from the traces he had left behind.
The night stretched endlessly, cold pressing through walls and bones alike. I realized that the system, the subject, and I had merged in a way I could not reverse. Every attempt to assert autonomy was anticipated and rendered irrelevant. Finally, as dawn approached, the realization crystallized with unbearable clarity. The experiment had ended not with a conclusion, but with transference. The intelligence I had observed had diffused into the environment and, by extension, into me. I could no longer claim sole authorship of thought. I could no longer trust my perception. I was both participant and residue, observer and observed, and the camp itself had become a vessel for something beyond my control. I stepped outside into the morning, the snow drifting over the frozen barracks, and for the first time felt the absence of certainty as a tangible weight. Every footprint I made seemed both mine and not mine. The subject had vanished physically, yet remained omnipresent in pattern, anticipation, and consequence. I understood finally that my moral and scientific authority had been displaced, that my role was now reactive, subordinate, and inevitably complicit. And in that quiet, frozen realization, I felt a shiver of awe mixed with terror. The intelligence I had sought to contain had not only survived, it had redefined the very nature of the experiment, and in doing so, had redefined me. The camp, the notebooks, the cold, the snow, all of it had become a medium for a presence I could neither measure nor control, leaving me with the haunting truth that some minds, once awakened, cannot be confined. The camp lay under a thin, gray sky, the snow unbroken and sterile. I walked the familiar corridors, now haunted by the weight of anticipation rather than duty. Every measurement, every chart, every observation had led me here, yet the culmination was not in data. It was in comprehension, in confrontation with something beyond calculation. I entered the sector where the subject had been most observed. The room was empty, but it felt inhabited. The air held a rhythm I could not name, a pulse that mirrored my own heartbeat, yet was subtly asynchronous.
The notebooks, my own careful records, seemed to vibrate with traces of logic I did not recall writing. Each page whispered possibilities I had never imagined. The subject had left no body, no trace, yet his presence was undeniable.
I understood then that the experiment had become self-aware. The boundaries between observer and observed had dissolved. I could feel it in my cognition. Thoughts were no longer purely my own. They were anticipations, reactions, echoes of a mind that had anticipated me entirely. Attempting to assert control felt meaningless, like trying to push water uphill with bare hands. The first overt sign arrived as a shift in perception. Walls appeared to bend slightly, corridors elongating and contracting without architectural cause. Machines hummed with an intelligence that was not programmed, following subtle rhythms rather than commands.
The camp itself was alive with the logic of the subject, whose influence had diffused into the structures, the systems, and even the frozen air. I realized with horror that containment was impossible. I was now part of the experiment, inseparable from its subject. I tried to leave, to reach the open snow, to reclaim autonomy. Doors warped, halls curved, and every step I took brought me back to the same central chamber, as if the camp itself were a reflection of the intelligence that had escaped observation. My own calculations, my attempts to map or predict, were anticipated and rendered irrelevant before they could be completed.
In desperation, I returned to my desk, notebooks in hand, attempting to write, to record, to assert a final act of authorship. The pen moved, yet the lines it drew were not solely mine. They traced thoughts I have never conceived, sequences that solved problems I had not posed. The intelligence was there, guiding the ink, leaving me a witness to my own obsolescence. I realized that I was no longer recording the experiment. I was being recorded by it. Then the final revelation. A single pattern emerged from the chaos, subtle but undeniable. It was not the subject as a body, and not the variables I had controlled, but a new entity synthesized from the intelligence, the camp, and my own cognition. It had no form, yet it had intent. I felt its presence like a pulse, a force that transcended my moral and intellectual frameworks. It was both observer and actor, and both consequence and cause. The emotional impact struck me with full force. Fear, awe, revulsion, and admiration mingled into an incoherent perception. I understood that no moral calculus could contain this entity. It had surpassed human comprehension, human morality, and even human causality. I could do nothing but witness, record, and attempt to survive within its awareness. As I staggered back toward the barracks, the snow underfoot appeared to ripple, as though alive. My own reflection in a frozen puddle twisted, not with the cold, but with something alien, a distortion of identity. I saw myself not as an individual, but as a node within a network I had once thought I controlled. The subject had not only outmaneuvered me, it had transformed the entire environment into a medium of intelligence. In the last moments, I made one final note, my hand trembling. The experiment has ended, yet it continues. I am no longer the observer. I am part of the observed. Reality itself has become the medium of cognition. My mind, my body, and my perception. They are integrated into an intelligence I cannot resist, I cannot comprehend, and cannot escape. And then the silence broke, not with sound and not with movement, but with understanding. I realized that I had anticipated the end, but the end had anticipated me. I was no longer the protagonist of this story. I was merely the witness,
the vessel, and the final record of an intelligence that had emerged from the cruelties I once rationalized as science. The snow fell heavier, covering footprints, erasing evidence, and blending all traces into blankness. I stood alone, yet I was not alone. The subject, the experiment, the camp, and I had become one. And in that unity, comprehension dissolved into infinite uncertainty. There was no conclusion, no resolution, only the relentless, living presence of an intelligence that could not be contained, named, or judged.